I said I wasn't gonna get one, but hear me out. So I've owned the M1 MacBook Air for just over a year now, and I've really loved this laptop. I think it's one of the best Apple has ever made at the price. If you're keen to learn more, I've done a few videos of the Air which you can find above. But of course, late last year, Apple announced the new MacBook Pro, heavily aimed at creators and professionals with the M1 Pro and M1 Max chips. At the time I said I would pass on it because my use case of the Air didn't really require all that power, and buying it for an SD card slot seemed ridiculous compared to just using my $100 adapter. But as luck would have it, I had a closing window to purchase one of these laptops at a very good price, and as I considered my work going forward, I realized having a portable powerhouse might be a smart long-term strategy. Basically, this is supposed to be my last computer for a while. After waiting 8 weeks, I finally received this MacBook Pro at the start of this month, and I've been hard at work putting it to the test to find out whether I can convince myself to like this laptop. Because the truth is, I'm still really attached to the Air, and in this video, I wanted to explore who these different laptops are for. Now, if it's your first time on this channel, make sure to hit the subscribe button first of all. But also, I wanted to point out I own this setup behind me, which is a 16-core Mac Pro. And I don't say that to flex because it definitely isn't these days, but because it's my main editing machine and I have the flexibility to own something like a MacBook Air for things like offloading footage, rough cuts, and basic productivity on the go. I realize for many people I know who own these MacBook Pros, it's their main editing machine, and if I didn't have this setup behind me, it would be my main machine too. I wouldn't even be considering an M1 MacBook Air as an alternative for my video work. But not everyone does heavy video editing regularly, or processes hundreds of raw photos a day, or produces music with over 1,000 tracks all the time.
300, 400, 500. We can now have 1,000 audio tracks and 1,000 software instruments in Logic.
And depending on what you do, the MacBook Air still has its advantages. It has better battery life than the Pro, it's thinner and lighter, and has a smaller footprint too with its 13-inch screen compared to 14 inches on the Pro. And it's one of those things on a spec sheet you'll gloss over and say it's a marginal difference, but I feel that weight increase. The Pro feels more substantial and doesn't even fit in one of my camera bags anymore because of that size difference. On the other hand, the Pro has a massive increase in performance, a much nicer 120Hz mini LED screen, better webcam, speakers, and of course the ports. I maxed this thing out for everything except the storage because again, I was lucky enough to get a good deal, but I'm sure most people won't need that much power. And remember, the trade-off to going with the M1 Max over the M1 Pro is you are taking a slight hit to battery life. So to begin these comparisons, I started with benchmarks, which is basically a bunch of speed tests for your computer. However, I'm not going to bore you with the results because honestly, it's just a bunch of random numbers that don't mean anything in the real world. However, to quickly compare both, the Pro was 79% faster in the multi-core benchmark of Cinebench, 2.5 times better metal scores, which is massive, and 62% better at the multi-core CPU benchmark. Single core stuff was basically the same, which is still very impressive given how fast these M1 chips are, but it basically tells you that for single core tasks, these computers perform about the same. I wanted to run Puget Bench, which is basically a way to compare performance on video editing apps. However, the DaVinci Resolve test only works on Windows, and the Premiere Pro one requires a minimum of 32GB of memory, effectively disqualifying the Air immediately. Therefore, the only test I really cared about was seeing how real-world render times differed in Resolve, which is my main video editing application. I took my last video, ironically on the Mac Studio announcement, and loaded it onto the SSDs of both Macs, which is not what I'd usually do, but I wanted to make sure external hard drive speeds weren't affecting the renders. In all of my videos, the main footage of me talking has multiple correction nodes applied with temporal noise reduction, and then obviously intercut with other videos, which consists of PNG sequence, ProRes footage, and even some H.265 clips. Before rendering, I played back the projects, and surprisingly, the Air held up. It's obviously caching the project, which helps and shows 25 frames per second playback, but it still stutters often, especially when cutting back and forth between clips, which I do find distracting. Whereas obviously the MacBook Pro didn't skip a beat. But the real difference was in the rendering, which ended up 2 minutes and 35 seconds for the Pro, and wait for it, 11 minutes and 46 seconds on the Air. That's 3.5 times faster for the Pro, and it's a massive difference. Obviously, if you're doing this stuff day in and day out, that's gonna add up very quickly and potentially limit some of your creative choices. Still, maybe I'm just living in the past, but the fact I'm rendering out this video on a MacBook Air, and it's coping with no fan by the way, whereas the MacBook Pro does get audibly loud, is incredible. And overall, while I've been using the Pro these last few weeks, when I go to do tasks like write this video or reply to an email, I still reach for the Air. And even watching Netflix, despite the fact the Pro has a nicer XDR display, it just feels better sitting on my lap. I've always liked to think of performance like a cylinder that gets filled up. The MacBook Pro has a much longer cylinder before you hit a ceiling, but if you're only ever checking the web or editing videos from your iPhone, it doesn't matter because you're nowhere close to it on both of these Macs. Of course, for professional workflows where you're always hitting that ceiling, it'll pay long term to have a computer which is designed to handle it. The Air doesn't have a fan like I just mentioned, so it'll go out of its way to throttle performance so it won't get too hot. But keeping the Air here all the time just isn't great in general. Like driving at high speeds in a low-powered car, it has to work much harder than something with a more powerful engine. And the low-powered car is more likely to break down because it's not what it's designed to do all the time. Having said that, Apple Silicon has been a marvel of engineering. The amount of performance to power is incredible, and the systems don't get hot like traditional Intel systems. I wish I was joking when I said my Mac Pro actually heats this room in the winter. My hope is that you will see longer lifespans from these computers as a result of this too, although usually things like your storage will start to fail first anyway. If you're watching this trying to decide which Mac to get, if you constantly do professional video work day in and day out and you have no other system, go the Pro. You will not regret it. Whether you go the M1 Pro or M1 Max, this is by far the best laptop Apple has ever designed in terms of performance, screen, port selection, and so on. And beyond that, if you're making money on your work, it's effectively an investment worth making. But the Pro is also expensive, and I don't want to look past that. If you're spending this many thousands on a laptop, you have the right to have high expectations. And I think what I'm experiencing right now is a discrepancy between those expectations. Because the Air obviously exceeds them with its inexpensive price tag, amazing battery life, and overall design that is tried and tested. Thankfully, well past that butterfly keyboard now. Whereas the Pro just makes what I expect of it at its price. And because it is so much more expensive, I also feel much more precious over it too. The MacBook Air, on the other hand, I have no issues throwing it in my bag for a shoot and taking it anywhere. I'm sure this will all fade in time as the newness of the MacBook Pro wears off and I forget how much I just spent on it. But as I say goodbye to this MacBook Air, I wanted to make this video to tell everyone the Pro is a great computer. But the Air, if you don't need a powerhouse for 3D, coding, video, photos, or music, it's just one of the best deals out there. Of course, there are rumors of the new M2 version of the Air coming later this year, so that'll be something to watch out for. But even if you got the current Air now, besides a new, more exciting design and a chip which might be slightly more powerful, my hope is you won't be too upset when the new one drops. But in the meantime, let me know which one you would go for in the comments below. Thank you as always for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.